The lavender fields of Verath 7 stretched out in every direction like a soft purple ocean, and the wind carried the laughter of children across the hills like music that never wanted to end. It was the year 2487, and humanity had spread across hundreds of star systems, building colonies on worlds that their ancestors could never have imagined, and Verath 7 was one of the quietest among them. A small farming world on the edge of the Orion expanse, where people came not to find adventure but to find peace. Commander Idris Akafer stood on the porch of the colony's administration building and watched the sun dip behind the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and deep violet, and he let out a long breath that carried all the weight of a man who had once commanded warships, but now commanded nothing more dangerous than crop rotation schedules. He was 63 years old with gray hair cut short, and a face lined by decades of service and loss, and he had come to Verath 5 years ago after his wife, Amina, had died from an illness she caught on a station near the border, and he had told the Naval Command that he was done with war and done with space, and done with everything except maybe growing something instead of destroying it. They had let him go, and he had never looked back. Down the hill from where he stood, the lantern school glowed warm and bright against the coming darkness, and through its wide windows he could see the shapes of children moving around inside, 300 of them ranging from 4 years old to 14, and their voices drifted up the hill in a chorus of shouts and giggles, and the occasional dramatic scream that meant someone had probably stolen someone else's dessert. Dr. Lena Vasquez ran the school with the energy of a woman half her age and the fierceness of a woman twice her size, and she had a rule that every child in her care would go to bed feeling safe and loved and full of food, and she had never once broken that rule in the 7 years since she left her career as a trauma surgeon to come here. She had seen too much blood in her old life, too many bodies on operating tables that she could not put back together, and she had decided one morning that she would rather build young minds than stitch torn flesh. And so she had traded her surgical tools for picture books and chalk, and the endless patience required to teach a room full of 7-year-olds how to spell the word galaxy. Tonight she was reading a bedtime story to the youngest group, the 4- and 5-year-olds who lived in the school's dormitory wing, because their parents worked the night harvest shifts, and she was not reading alone. Beside her sat Ambassador Silrethi Khan of the Velnoxy, a tall insectoid being with shimmering green-black carapace and 4 delicate arms and large multifaceted eyes that reflected the light like wet gemstones. And he was holding the picture book with 2 of his hands while using the other 2 to make dramatic shadow puppets on the wall behind him. The children loved him beyond all reason. Every time he clicked his mandibles together to make the sound effects for the story, a sharp tack-tack-tack for a spaceship taking off, a soft thrumming hum for a lullaby, the children erupted into laughter so loud that Vasquez had to shush them 3 times, though she was laughing too. Khan had been the Velnoxy diplomatic representative to Verath 7 for 2 years now, and in that time he had become as much a part of the colony as the lavender fields themselves, and he had once told Akafer over a cup of something that humans called tea and Velnoxy called hot leaf sadness, that he considered the children of the colony to be what his people called Vaishara, sacred noise, the sound of a future being born. Akafer had liked that very much. But Akafer also knew something that the children and the farmers and even Vasquez did not think about very often, which was that Verath 7 was alone out here on the edge of known space, and the nearest military outpost was 6 days away at full speed, and the colony's entire defense force consisted of 40 volunteers with rifles and a single orbital sensor array that was older than some of the teenagers in the school. It had never mattered before because nobody had ever cared about Verath 7, and that was exactly how Akafer liked it. But the galaxy was a big and restless place, and not every species in it shared the Velnoxy fondness for sacred noise. Out beyond the borders of the Galactic Concord, the great multi-species governing body that kept a fragile peace among hundreds of civilizations. There were empires that operated by older and crueler rules, and the coldest among them was the Draveth Imperium. The Draveth were reptilian in form, tall and scaled and sharp-eyed, with a society built on hierarchy and dominance and the absolute belief that the strong existed to use the weak. And they had spent centuries conquering smaller species not to destroy them, but to absorb them, stripping their populations for labor and their children for conscription into the Imperium's endless military machine. They called it the harvest, and they spoke of it the way a farmer might speak of pulling weeds necessary and without emotion. The Galactic Conquered had denied the Draveth membership 3 times because of this practice, and the Draveth had responded each time with the diplomatic equivalent of a shrug, because they did not need the Conquered's approval, and they did not fear the Conquered's judgment, and they certainly did not understand why so many species found the taking of children to be offensive. Children were resources, after all, and resources existed to be used. What the Draveth did fear, or at least what made them cautious, was humanity. Humans were strange creatures in the eyes of the galaxy, and most species agreed on this even if they agreed on nothing else, because humans were the only known civilization that would burn worlds over their offspring, and the Conquered's xenopsychology archives contained a warning that had been flagged in red text for over a century. Do not threaten human young under any circumstances, as the species responds to such threats with a disproportionate and often civilization-ending level of collective violence that no diplomatic framework can contain or predict. The Draveth High Command had read this warning, and most of them had dismissed it as Conquered exaggeration, because they had conquered dozens of species and every single one of them had eventually submitted, and surely humans were no different despite their reputation. But the Draveth had also been careful to avoid human space, until now. A Draveth scout fleet had been mapping the edges of the Orion expanse for months, cataloging worlds and populations and resources, and when their long-range sensors found Verath 7, a small colony, far from military support, lightly defended, and containing hundreds of young biological specimens in prime conscription age. The report had gone straight to the desk of Warlord Kashrith Val, commander of the Draveth's 4th expansion fleet. Kashrith Val was ancient even by Draveth standards, with scales that had darkened to near black and eyes like chips of yellow ice, and he had overseen more harvests than he could remember, and this one struck him as barely worth his attention. A tiny farming colony, a handful of armed civilians, 300 children, it would take half a day at most. He gave the order without hesitation and without ceremony, the way someone might swat an insect. On the bridge of the colony's administration building, a sensor console beeped twice and then flickered in a way that made the night shift technician frown and lean forward in her chair, and she tapped the screen and watched as a cluster of signatures appeared at the edge of the system. Too many to be asteroids and too organized to be debris. She called Akefer on the comm. He arrived 3 minutes later, still pulling on his jacket, and he looked at the screen for a long moment with an expression that the technician had never seen on his face before, the expression of a man who had spent decades at war and recognized the shape of death even from a distance. "That is not a meteor cluster," he said quietly, and his voice carried a weight that made the room go very still. Outside the window, the lights of the lantern school glowed warm against the dark, and inside it 300 children slept without knowing that the stars above them had just become very dangerous. They came at dawn when the sky was still caught between night and morning, and the lavender fields were wet with dew, and the first thing they killed was the silence. A sound like thunder rolled across the valley as the Draveth dropships broke through the atmosphere, in a V formation so tight and precise that it looked like a blade cutting through the clouds. And behind them, the sky itself seemed to darken, as the bulk of Warlord Kashrith Val's fleet settled into orbit above the colony like a predator crouching over a nest. On the bridge of his flagship, the Revenant Fang, Khazrith Val watched the tactical display with the bored patience of someone who had done this 100 times before, and beside him stood Sub-Commander Erith, younger and sharper, and carrying a tension in her posture that her superior either did not notice or did not care about. "Jamming is complete," Erith reported, her clawed fingers moving across her console. "No signal will leave this system, their distress beacons, their communication relays, their personal devices, everything is dead." "Good," Khazrith Val said without looking at her. "Begin the harvest." Down on the surface, Commander Akafer had not slept, and he had spent the hours since the sensor contact organizing the only defense Verath 7 had 40 men and women with rifles and courage, and absolutely nothing else that could stop what was coming. He stood in front of them in the gray pre-dawn light and looked at their faces, and he saw fear in every single one of them. But he also saw something underneath the fear that made his chest tight with pride, because not one of them had run, and not one of them had hesitated when he called them. "We cannot win this fight," he told them plainly, because he had never believed in lying to people who were about to risk their lives. "But we can buy time, and every minute we buy is a minute for the school to lock down, so that is what we are going to do." A farmer named Daishi, who was holding a rifle that looked too big for his thin arms, raised his hand and asked how long they needed to hold. And Akafer looked at him and said, "As long as we can," and Daishi nodded once and said nothing more. The Draveth hit the colony like a fist. The first wave came in fast and armored and utterly without mercy. Reptilian soldiers in black combat gear pouring out of their dropships before the engines had even finished cycling down. And they moved through the outer farms with a mechanical efficiency that spoke of long practice and total indifference to the lives they were disrupting. Akafer's militia met them at the edge of the residential quarter, and for 11 terrible minutes they held the line with nothing but bolt-action rifles and the kind of desperate fury that only comes from defending your home. And 3 of them died in the first exchange of fire, and 5 more went down in the second. But the rest kept shooting and kept screaming and kept standing in the path of something they could not possibly stop. Akafer himself took a plasma round to his left side that burned through his jacket and scorched the flesh beneath, and he staggered but did not fall, and he fired 6 more shots before a second round hit his leg and dropped him to the dirt. A young woman named Priya dragged him behind a wall and pressed her hands against the wound in his side, while the world exploded around them, and Akafer grabbed her arm and said through gritted teeth, "The school. Tell me the school is locked down." And Priya nodded with tears running down her face and said, "Vasquez sealed it 10 minutes ago." Inside the Lantern School, Dr. Lena Vasquez had done exactly what she had drilled for and prayed she would never have to do. The moment the first explosions shook the windows, she had activated the emergency protocol, and within 4 minutes every child in the building had been moved to the underground bunkers beneath the school, reinforced shelters that Akafer had insisted on building when the colony was first established, and which most people had thought were unnecessary on such a peaceful world. Vasquez stood at the top of the bunker stairs with a surgical laser in her hand, a tool designed to cut through bone and tissue with precision, but equally capable of cutting through other things. And she had positioned the 6 other teachers at various points throughout the building, each armed with whatever they could find. "Nobody gets down those stairs," she told them, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had once held a dying soldier's heart in her hands and squeezed it back to life, and there was no fear in it at all. The Draveth reached the school 20 minutes after the initial assault. 2 soldiers came through the main entrance, and Vasquez killed the first one with a single cut of the surgical laser across his throat before he even saw her, and she wounded the second badly enough that he retreated howling into the corridor, and for a brief and shining moment she thought they might actually hold. But then more came, and more after that, and the school was not a fortress and she was not an army, and after she killed a third soldier and wounded two more, they finally hit her with a stun blast that dropped her to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The Draveth moved through the school with scanners that led them straight to the bunkers, and they cut through the reinforced doors with plasma torches. And when the doors fell open, the soldiers looked down into the darkness and saw rows of small faces staring up at them with wide and terrified eyes. They took 214 children that morning. The soldiers herded them out of the bunkers and across the ruined grounds of the school and into the waiting dropships with the same brisk efficiency with which they did everything. And the children cried and screamed and reached for parents who were not there. And the Draveth soldiers ignored all of it because to them, these were not children but inventory. And inventory did not have feelings that mattered. A girl named Tova, who was 9 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, was pushed into a cryopod aboard one of the carriers. And the pod was cold and tight and smelled like metal. And in the pod beside her, a toddler named Kai was crying so hard that his whole body shook. Tova reached her hand through the narrow gap between their pods and found his tiny fingers and held them. And she began to sing the lullaby that her father always sang to her before bed, a simple song about stars and the spaces between them. And she sang it quietly and steadily, until Kai's crying faded to hiccups, and then to silence, and then to the deep, slow breathing of a child who had found something to hold onto in the dark. On the bridge of the Revenant Fang, Sub-Commander Verath watched the tactical feeds from the surface and felt something move in her chest that she did not have a word for, something that sat between discomfort and dread, and she pushed it down the way she had been trained to push down anything that was not useful. Kazrith Val stood beside her and watched the same feeds with the satisfaction of a task completed on schedule. "The adults?" Verath asked. "Leave them," the warlord said, waving one clawed hand dismissively. "They can breed more. There is no strategic value in killing livestock when you have already taken what you came for." He said this the way someone might discuss the weather, and Verath looked at him and then looked away and said nothing. The Draveth fleet pulled out of orbit 3 hours after they had arrived, taking the children and leaving behind a colony that looked like it had been stepped on by something enormous. And in the wreckage and the smoke and the grief that followed, most of the colonists could do nothing but sit in the dirt and stare at the sky where their children had been taken. But one being had survived unseen. Ambassador Silrethi Khan had hidden during the attack, pressing himself flat against the underside of a collapsed roof section, where his insectoid camouflage made him nearly invisible against the dark debris. And he had remained motionless for 3 hours while his hearts pounded in a rhythm that his people reserved for absolute terror. When the Draveth ships were finally gone, he crawled out into the ruined colony and searched until he found Akafar lying against a shattered wall with blood soaking through the bandages that Priya had wrapped around his torso, and the old commander was conscious but barely, and in his right hand he was clutching a small shoe. A child's shoe, pink and scuffed and missing its lace. Khan knelt beside him and placed 2 of his 4 hands on Akafar's shoulders, and Akafar looked up at him with eyes that held a pain far worse than any wound and whispered, "They took them, Khan. They took our children." Khan clicked his mandibles once, a sound that in Velnoxy meant grief too large for language, and then he reached beneath his carapace and pulled out a personal subspace communicator, a device so old and low-powered that the Draveth jamming had not even registered it as a threat. He activated it and pointed it at the sky, and began transmitting a single message on a repeating loop, pushing the tiny device to its absolute limit, sending his voice out into the black void between the stars. "They took the children," his voice crackled across the frequency, thin and desperate and burning with something that sounded like holy rage. "They took the human children." The signal was weak and it was small and it traveled slowly, but it traveled far enough, and 14 hours later it reached a conquered relay station in the Ashimer system where a communications officer, a tall 4-armed Rithani woman named Selen, was monitoring routine traffic. She heard the message and played it again and then played it a third time. And with each replay, the color drained further from her face until she looked almost gray. And she sat very still for a long moment before she reached for the priority channel that connected directly to the conquered High Council and to the United Human Government. Her hands were shaking. "Oh no," she whispered to herself as the channel opened, and the first alerts began to cascade across a dozen star systems. What have the Draveth done? The news hit human space like a shockwave, and it moved faster than light because grief and rage have never respected the laws of physics. Within 6 hours of the signal reaching the first relay station, every human colony and every human station and every human ship in every corner of the galaxy knew what had happened on Verath 7, and the reaction was something that no species in the Galactic conquered had ever witnessed before, not from humans and not from anyone else. There was no debate. There was no political argument, no partisan division, no one asking whether the cost was worth it or whether diplomacy should be tried first, or whether perhaps the situation was more complicated than it appeared. 214 children had been taken from their beds, and that was the only fact that mattered, and every human being who heard it understood this in the same instant, and in the same way, as though the entire species shared a single nerve that had just been touched by fire. Fleet Admiral Renée Cortez received the report at her desk aboard the UHS Dominion, flagship of the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, and she read it once in silence, and then set the datapad down with a steadiness that made her aide take a step backward, because the aide had served with Cortez for 9 years and had never once seen her hands that still. Cortez was 51 years old with silver-streaked black hair and eyes the color of iron, and she had 2 daughters ages 12 and 8, and she kept a picture of them on her desk in a frame that her youngest had decorated with stickers of cartoon planets. She looked at that picture for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pressed the fleet-wide channel and said 5 words in a voice that carried no emotion and needed none. Set condition absolute all ships. Condition absolute had not been declared in the United Human Star Force in over 80 years, and there were officers in the fleet who had only read about it in history books. And when they heard it announced over the comms, every single one of them felt a chill run through their body, because condition absolute meant that the entire military structure of humanity was now operating under a single unified command with a single purpose, and without any of the restraints that peacetime regulations imposed. It meant total war. And it was not just the military that moved. Across human space, something ancient and primal woke up in the civilian population, something that lived in the DNA of a species that had spent 100,000 years protecting its young from predators on a dangerous little planet called Earth, and that instinct did not care about politics or economics or the careful calculations of diplomacy. Factory worlds that had been producing agricultural equipment shut down their assembly lines, and within 24 hours were producing weapon systems and ship components. And nobody had ordered them to do this. They simply did it, the way a heart beats without being told. Civilian transport ships reported to the nearest military station and volunteered for service, and their captains did not ask what the mission was because they already knew. And retired soldiers by the millions pulled their old uniforms out of storage and found that the fabric still fit, even if it was tighter than they remembered. The scale of it was staggering, and it happened so fast that the Conquered's intelligence services could not even track it properly. And a Rithani analyst who had spent 30 years studying human behavior stared at his screens and said to his colleague, "They are not mobilizing an army. They are mobilizing a civilization." On the floor of the Galactic Conquered assembly, the alien ambassadors watched the reports come in with a mixture of awe and genuine terror, because many of them had theoretical knowledge of what humans were capable of when provoked. But theory and reality were very different things, and the reality was breathtaking in its fury. The Telhari ambassador, a species known for their mathematical precision, calculated the rate of human mobilization, and then recalculated it because he assumed he had made an error. And when the second calculation matched the first, he stood up from his seat and left the chamber without saying a word. Several ambassadors from neutral species approached the human delegation and urged restraint and negotiation. And they spoke carefully and reasonably about the importance of diplomatic channels and proportional responses, and the dangers of escalation. The human ambassador to the conquered was a quiet grandfatherly man named Thomas Ape, who had spent 40 years building bridges between species and who was known throughout the diplomatic community for his patience and his gentle humor and his ability to find common ground where none seemed to exist. He listened to every word the alien diplomat said, and he nodded politely, and then he removed his diplomatic credentials from around his neck and placed them on the table in front of him with a soft click that somehow silenced the entire chamber. "There is nothing to negotiate," he said, and then he turned and walked out. General Secretary Amara Os addressed the entire human species that evening in a broadcast that reached every colony and every ship and every station and every outpost where a human being drew breath. She stood behind a simple podium with no flags and no decorations, and she wore no symbols of office, and she looked directly into the camera with eyes that were wet but steady, and she spoke in a voice that did not waver. "By now you all know what happened on Verath 7, she began. "You know that the Draveth Imperium attacked a peaceful colony and took 214 of our children, our sons and daughters, our bobbies, and carried them away into the dark." She paused and took a breath that the microphones caught, and in that breath the listening billions heard a mother and not a politician. "To the Draveth Imperium I say this. You have made an error that no apology can fix, that no treaty can mend, and that no surrender can undo. You touched our children, and now every ship we have is coming. Every soldier we have is coming, and we will not stop until every child is home, and your ability to do this to anyone ever again no longer exists." She paused again. "To the galaxy I say this. Do not stand in our way, not because we threaten you, but because you know that if it were your children you would do the same." The broadcast ended, and across human space no one spoke for a long time, and then everyone moved at once. The response from the alien species of the conquered came swiftly, and it came in forms that surprised even the most experienced diplomats. The Rithani, tall, four-armed, and proud, had been humanity's allies for decades, and their response was immediate and absolute, as their ambassador simply transmitted a fleet deployment order to the human military command with a note that read, "Our ships are yours. Tell us where to point them." The Velnoxy High Council convened an emergency session, and within 3 hours had declared the Draveth to be enemies of all larval life everywhere, which in Velnoxy culture was the most extreme condemnation possible, and they committed their entire defensive fleet to the human cause, with a formal statement that Silrethi Khan's message had awakened an obligation that no Velnoxy could ignore. But the most stunning response came from the Korvathi. The Korvathi were a warrior species who had fought a bitter war against humanity 60 years ago, a war that had ended in a draw that both sides called a victory and neither side had forgotten. And they were not allies, and they were not friends, and they had spent decades watching humanity with the wary respect of a predator that had met its equal. Their communiqué arrived on Admiral Cortez's desk without warning, and it read, "We were your enemies once, and we know what you are capable of when you are calm. We do not wish to imagine what you are capable of now. We will not stand in your way, and we have decided that we will walk beside you, because any species that fights this way for its young has earned the right to not fight alone." Cortez read it twice, and then forwarded it to every ship in her fleet without comment. Across the galaxy, species that had been neutral or even hostile to humanity quietly began moving their ships and their stations, and their people out of the path between human space and Draveth space. Because whatever was about to happen, they did not want to be caught in the middle of it. In the Draveth capital, the Imperium's intelligence service finally compiled a full report on the human mobilization and presented it to the High Command, and the numbers in the report made several senior officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. But Warlord Kashrith Val read it with the same lazy confidence with which he did everything. "They are emotional creatures," he said, flicking the report aside with one clawed hand. "They will posture and threaten, and eventually they will send diplomats to negotiate for the return of the specimens, and we will offer terms, and they will accept because that is what every species does." Subcommander Verath said nothing during the briefing, but afterward she went to her quarters and accessed the Concord's xenobiology archives, databases that the Draveth had obtained through espionage years ago, and she began reading everything she could find about humanity. She read about their evolution on a world where everything was trying to kill them, the predators and the weather and the diseases and even each other. And she read about their wars, the ones they fought against themselves before they ever reached the stars, wars of such scale and such ferocity that the Concord historians who studied them had to invent new categories of violence. She read about the world wars and the atomic bombs, and the way human soldiers had charged into certain death not for territory or resources but for ideas and for flags and for the people standing beside them. And she read about a human concept called scorched earth, which meant destroying everything you had rather than letting an enemy take it. And then she found a human proverb that had been translated into Galactic Common and flagged by a Concord analyst with a note that simply said, "Take this seriously." The proverb read, "Heaven has no rage like love to hatred turned." Verath sat in her quarters for a long time after reading that, and then she went to Kashrith Val's chambers and stood before him, and for the first time in her career, she spoke without being spoken to first. "Warlord," she said, and her voice was thin and strange, "I do not think they are coming to negotiate." Kashrith Val looked at her with his yellow ice eyes and said nothing. 3 hours later, the first ships of the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the border of Draveth space. 400 warships emerging from the void in perfect formation, with their weapons hot, and their shields up, and their running lights burning red, which in the human naval tradition meant that no quarter would be given, and none would be asked. And behind them, more signatures appeared on the Draveth border sensors, dozens, and then hundreds, and then thousands, ship after ship after ship dropping out of hyperspace in an endless cascade that filled the darkness with steel and fury. The Draveth border stations counted over 12,000 vessels before the sensors themselves were destroyed by the leading edge of the fleet, and the last transmission from the outermost station was a single word repeated 3 times in a voice that no longer sounded like it belonged to a soldier of the mighty Draveth Imperium. It sounded like it belonged to someone who had just realized that the universe contained things far more frightening than anything they had ever imagined. The word was impossible. The war lasted 11 days, and calling it a war was generous because a war implies that both sides have a chance of winning. On the first day, the human fleet hit the Draveth border fortifications with everything they had, and Admiral René Cortez employed a strategy that was so simple and so brutal that the Concord's military analysts who watched it unfold from a safe distance could not believe what they were seeing. There were no clever flanking maneuvers, no feints, no diversions, no attempts to draw the enemy out of position or exploit weaknesses in their formation. There was only the full and total weight of 12,000 warships crashing into the Draveth defenses like a river smashing through a dam. The Concord analysts later gave this strategy a name. They called it the Flood. And when they wrote their reports about it, they noted with a kind of horrified admiration that the humans had not even tried to minimize their own casualties, because ships that were crippled beyond repair did not retreat or surrender, but instead accelerated directly into the nearest Draveth station and detonated their reactors on impact. The Draveth had conquered dozens of species across centuries of expansion, and every single one of those species had fought according to rational principles of self-preservation. They attacked when they had advantage, and retreated when they did not, and surrendered when the mathematics of survival demanded it. Humans did not do this. Humans kept coming regardless of the cost, and the Draveth officers who commanded the border defenses discovered in the first hours of the battle that they had no tactical framework for fighting an enemy that genuinely did not care whether it lived or died, as long as the enemy died too. By the end of the third day, the entire Draveth border defense network had ceased to exist, and the human fleet poured through the gap like water through a broken levee, and spread across Draveth space in a dozen simultaneous thrusts, aimed at every military installation that intelligence had identified. But the fleet was not moving randomly. It was moving with purpose, and the purpose was the children. On the fourth day, a Marine strike force led by a woman named Captain Yara Mensa identified the Draveth carrier that was transporting the children of Verath 7, and Mensa's team had been chosen for this mission specifically because every single member of it had children of their own, and Admiral Cortez had looked each of them in the eye before they launched and said, "Bring them home," and nothing else. The carrier was deep in Draveth space and surrounded by escort ships, and Mensa's force was small, 4 assault shuttles carrying 60 Marines. But they hit the carrier with a precision and a violence that the escort commanders had never seen from any boarding action in their experience. The Marines breached the carrier's hull in 3 places simultaneously, and they moved through the corridors with a speed that the Draveth defenders could not match. And there was something in the way the humans fought, a quality that went beyond training and beyond discipline, and into something older and more primal. That made the Draveth soldiers hesitate for half a second every time they came face to face with one of them. That half second was all the Marines needed. Captain Mensa reached the cryochamber 14 minutes after the initial breach, and she killed the 2 guards outside the door so quickly that neither of them managed to fire a single shot. And then she opened the door and stepped inside and saw rows upon rows of small cryopods stretching out into the cold blue darkness of the chamber. She walked to the nearest pod and looked through the frosted glass and saw a small face inside, a child, sleeping, alive. And she pressed her hand against the glass and stood there for 3 seconds that contained more emotion than most people experience in a lifetime. Then she activated her comm and said in a voice that cracked on every other word, "This is Mensa. We have them. The children are alive. I repeat, the children are alive." The message traveled from her comm to the assault shuttle to the fleet relay to every single ship in the human armada in under 11 seconds. And when it reached them, something happened that none of the alien observers expected. Every human ship in the fleet, all 12,000 of them, sounded their horns simultaneously, and the sound rolled across the void like the voice of something ancient and enormous waking from a long sleep. And for one perfect moment, every gun in the fleet went silent, and every crew on every ship stopped what they were doing and listened to the sound of their own collective relief. The cryopods were opened carefully and methodically, and the children were woken one by Marines who had been briefed on pediatric emergency protocols, and who handled each child with a gentleness that stood in absolute contrast to the violence they had committed minutes before to reach this room. Tova was the 37th child to be woken, and when the pod hissed open and the cold air rushed out, she blinked against the light and looked up and saw a face looking down at her. A human face, broad and dark and scarred and streaked with sweat and someone else's blood. And the face belonged to a Marine sergeant named Kofi Acer, who was 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 240 pounds, and had once carried a wounded comrade 6 miles through enemy territory without stopping. Tova looked at him with her dark eyes and said, "I knew you would come." Kofi Acer, who had not cried when he was shot on Tarse's IV, who had not cried when his brother died, who had not cried in 23 years of military service, dropped to his knees on the cold metal floor and gathered Tova into his arms and wept like a child himself, and his shoulders shook and his tears fell on her hair, and she wrapped her small arms around his neck and held on. The children were safe, and many in the Galactic Concord expected humanity to stop. They did not. Admiral Cortez's orders arrived within the hour, transmitted to every ship and every commander with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. The children are secured, now dismantle their capacity. Every shipyard, every weapons factory, every military academy, every cryo facility that has ever held a stolen child of any species, all of it comes down. And so for the next 4 days, the human fleet methodically and systematically destroyed the Draveth Imperium's ability to wage war, not through genocide, not through the slaughter of civilians, not through the kind of indiscriminate violence that the Draveth themselves had practiced for centuries, but through the precise and total annihilation of every piece of military infrastructure that the Imperium possessed. Shipyards that had taken decades to build were reduced to debris fields in hours, and weapons factories that had armed the Draveth war machine for generations were turned to slag, and military academies where the conscripted children of conquered species had been forced to train were emptied, and then leveled to the ground. The Draveth civilian population was not touched, and human ships flew past Draveth cities and Draveth farms and Draveth homes without firing a single shot at any of them. And this restraint confused the Draveth almost more than the violence did, because in their experience conquest meant destruction of everything, and they could not understand an enemy that was capable of total annihilation, but chose to stop at the line between military and civilian. On the 9th day, Warlord Kashrith Val rallied what remained of the Draveth military for a final stand above the Draveth homeworld, and he stood on the bridge of the Revenant Fang, and addressed his remaining forces with a speech about Draveth supremacy and the eternal strength of the Imperium, and the glory of dying in battle. The battle lasted 4 hours. The Revenant Fang was the last Draveth ship still fighting when the human Marines boarded it, and Kashrith Val met them in the corridors of his own flagship with a blade in each hand and the cold fury of a predator that knows it is cornered. And he killed 3 Marines before Captain Mensa found him. They fought hand to hand in a corridor lit by sparking wires and the red glow of emergency lighting, and Kashrith Val was fast and strong, and he had been killing since before Mensa's grandparents were born. But Mensa had something inside her that was older than skill and stronger than experience. Inside her helmet, taped to the visor where she could see it every time she looked forward, was a photograph of her daughter, a 4-year-old girl named Essie who had her mother's smile, and who had said, "Come home soon, Mama," the last time Mensa had held her. Mensa drove her blade through Kashrith Val's throat, and the warlord looked at her with his yellow ice eyes as the life drained from them. And in the last moment before the light went out of those eyes, Mensa saw something that might have been surprise, because in all his centuries of war and conquest and harvest, Kashrith Val had never truly believed that the things he took had anyone who would come for them. On the 10th day, Subcommander Verath, now the highest-ranking Draveth officer still alive, broadcast an unconditional surrender on all frequencies, and the guns finally fell silent across what had once been the Draveth Imperium. She was brought before Admiral Cortez on the bridge of the Dominion, and she stood in her tattered uniform before a woman who had just dismantled an empire in less than 2 weeks, and Verath asked the only question that mattered to her in that moment. "Will you destroy our world?" Cortez looked at her for a very long time, and the bridge was so quiet that the hum of the life support system sounded like thunder. And then Cortez spoke in a voice that was tired and hard, and carried the weight of everything she had done and ordered others to do. "No," she said, "we are not you." The Galactic Concord Tribunal convened within 48 hours, and humanity presented its demands, and the conquered granted every single one of them without objection, because no species in the chamber was foolish enough to argue with the civilization that had just ended an empire in 11 days. The Draveth were disarmed completely and permanently, and every conscripted child of every species that the Draveth had taken over centuries of conquest was identified and returned to their homeworld, and the entire Draveth leadership was arrested and tried for crimes against sentient life, and the Draveth homeworld was placed under conquered monitoring for 500 years. The Draveth Imperium, which had stood for 1,000 years and conquered 40 species and believed itself to be eternal, ceased to exist, not through extinction, but through the total and irreversible destruction of everything that had made it powerful. In her cell awaiting trial, Verath sat alone and stared at the wall and replayed in her mind the moment she had read humanity's history in the stolen conquered archives. And she thought about the proverb she had found, and the warning she had given Kashrith Val, and the way he had dismissed her with his yellow ice eyes. We did not conquer a species, she thought, and the thought carried a weight that pressed down on her chest like a stone. We poked something sleeping and ancient and full of love, and we expected it not to wake up, and when it woke up it was the most terrible thing the galaxy had ever seen. 6 months after the war that erased the Draveth Imperium from the map of the galaxy, the lavender fields of Verath 7 bloomed again, and their color was the same soft purple it had always been, as if the soil itself had decided that what happened above it was not reason enough to stop being beautiful. The colony had been rebuilt, not just repaired but rebuilt from the ground up with materials and labor donated by 11 different species, and the new buildings were stronger than the old ones, and the new sensor array was military grade, and the new defensive grid could track a ship from 3 systems away. But the most important thing that had been rebuilt was the Lantern School. It stood on the same hill where the original had stood, and it had the same wide windows and the same warm light, and it had a new bell mounted above the front door. A bronze bell that had been forged from the melted-down hull plating of the Revenant Fang, Kashrith Val's flagship, because someone on the rebuilding committee had decided that there was a kind of justice in turning a warlord ship into something that called children to their lessons. Tova rang that bell on opening day. She stood on a small step stool because she was not quite tall enough to reach the rope, and she pulled it with both hands, and the sound that came out was clear and bright and carried across the valley like a voice, announcing to the universe that the children of Verath 7 were still here and still alive and still not afraid. Below her, the crowd that had gathered for the reopening stretched from the school's front steps all the way down to the edge of the lavender fields, and it was not just humans in that crowd. There were Rithani and Velnoxy and Korvathi, and a dozen other species who had sent representatives to witness this moment, because what had happened here had become something larger than one colony and one school and one group of stolen children. It had become a symbol, and the galaxy does not forget its symbols easily. Commander Idris Akefer watched from the edge of the crowd, leaning on a cane that he hated and would probably need for the rest of his life, and the plasma burns on his side had healed into scars that pulled at his skin when he moved too quickly. But he was alive, and he was here, and that was more than he had expected on the morning the Draveth came. He watched Tova ring the bell, and he felt something warm and wet slide down his cheek, and he did not wipe it away because he was 63 years old, and he had earned the right to cry in public without apology. Beside him stood Dr. Lena Vasquez, who had spent 3 weeks in a medical facility recovering from the stun blast and who still got headaches when she was tired, and she had returned to the school the moment the doctors cleared her, and had thrown herself into the rebuilding with the same fierce energy she brought to everything. And she had personally designed the new underground shelters which were now deep enough and strong enough to survive an orbital bombardment. She had also kept the surgical laser, and she carried it in a holster under her jacket, and when someone had asked her why she still carried a weapon in a school, she had looked at them with eyes that dared them to ask again, and they had not. Ambassador Silrethi Khan stood near the front of the crowd, his green-black carapace polished to a shine that caught the sunlight and threw it back in little rainbow fragments. And he was surrounded by children who clung to his forearms and his legs, and who had to be gently peeled off him by their parents, so that other people could also say hello. The Velnoxy government had awarded him their highest civilian honor for his role in sending the distress signal that had reached the conquered relay station, and the human government had given him a medal too, a simple silver disc engraved with the words "for the children," and he wore both of them on a sash across his chest. But the honor he valued most was the one the children of the Lantern School had given him, which was the title of permanent guest reader. A position that came with no authority and no salary, and the absolute obligation to do funny voices during story time. He had accepted it with a formal Velnoxy bow, and a clicking of his mandibles that the children knew was a smile. In the weeks and months following the war, the Galactic Concord had done something it had never done before. It had passed a universal law by unanimous vote, without a single abstention or objection, and it had done so in record time because every species in the Concord understood that what had happened at Verath 7 could not be allowed to happen again, not to human children, and not to anyone else's children. The law was called the Verath Accord, and it designated the children of all species as protected persons under galactic law, and it declared that the abduction or conscription or enslavement of the young of any sentient species was the single highest crime recognized by the conquered, punishable by the collective military response of every member civilization. The law was formal and precise in its language, as laws must be, but the galaxy did not call it by its formal name. The galaxy called it the human rule, and everyone understood what that meant. It meant that humanity had drawn a line in the stars, and the line did not protect only human children but all children everywhere. And crossing that line meant facing the same thing the Draveth had faced, and no species in the galaxy was eager to test whether the result would be any different. Several civilizations that had previously kept their distance from humanity began seeking closer relationships in the aftermath of the war, and when a Korvathi ambassador was asked by a journalist why his people, former enemies of humanity, had chosen to support the human fleet, he had given an answer that was reprinted in every major publication across the Concord. Any species that loves its young that fiercely is a species worth standing beside, he had said, and any species that stops destroying when the job is done instead of continuing out of rage is a species that understands something about strength that my people are still learning. Dr. Vasquez had started something new in the months after the reopening, a galaxy-wide program to identify and rehabilitate children of other species who had been taken by the Draveth over centuries of conquest, children who had been forced into military service or labor or worse, children whose families had given them up for lost. The program found thousands of them. They were scattered across the ruins of the Draveth Imperium, in abandoned military facilities and decommissioned training camps and forgotten outposts on worlds that nobody had visited in decades, and they were found one by one and brought home one by one, and each homecoming was a story in itself. A Rithani child reunited with parents who had mourned her for 20 years. A Velnoxy larva returned to a hive that had kept his chamber empty and waiting. A Korvathi youth who did not remember his homeworld, but who stepped off the transport ship and breathed the air and felt something inside him recognize it. Vasquez oversaw every case personally, and she slept very little during those months, and when people told her to rest, she would look at them with those fierce, tired eyes and say, "There is one more. There is always one more," and they would stop asking. The trial of the Draveth leadership lasted 3 months, and Sub-Commander Irith was the key witness, and she testified against every officer and every official who had participated in the harvest, and she provided the locations of hidden conscription facilities that the conquered investigators had not yet found, and each location she revealed led to more children brought home. During her testimony, A conquered prosecutor asked her why she had chosen to cooperate so completely when she could have remained silent and protected her former comrades. Verath looked at the tribunal, a panel of judges from 12 different species, and she was quiet for a long time before she answered. "Because I watched a human soldier weep when he found a child alive," she said, and her voice was steady, but there was something broken underneath it. "He was enormous and covered in blood, and he had just fought his way through a ship full of my people. And when he saw that little girl, he fell to his knees and cried as though his heart had split open." She paused. "My people would never weep for a child. We took them and used them, and never once considered that they were anything more than material. And I watched that soldier hold that girl, and I understood for the first time what we had done and what we were. And I realized that this capacity to love something small and fragile so much that you would burn the galaxy to protect it. This was why we lost." She paused again, and when she spoke next, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Not because they had more ships, because they had more heart." The tribunal was silent for a long time after that. On a warm evening 6 months and 12 days after the war, Tova sat in a field of lavender on the hill above the colony and looked up at the stars. And the sky was so clear that she could see the bright band of the galactic arm stretching across the darkness like a river of light. She was 10 years old now, and she had grown 2 inches since the day she was taken, and she still sometimes had nightmares about the cold of the cryopod. But the nightmares came less often now, and she had learned that when they came, she could hold onto the memory of Sergeant Kofi Asser's arms around her, and the sound of his crying, and the way his tears had felt warm on her hair, and the nightmare would let go. Sitting beside her was a girl she had met that afternoon, a Rithani child named Selha, who was visiting Verath 7 with her mother, a conquered diplomat. And Selha was roughly Tova's age, with 4 arms and large dark eyes, and a curious way of tilting her head when she was thinking about something. They had spent the afternoon chasing each other through the lavender fields and trying to teach each other words in their respective languages, and now they sat side by side in comfortable silence and watched the stars come out one by one. After a while, Selha turned to Tova and asked a question that her mother had told her not to ask, but which she could not help asking because she was young, and the young do not know how to leave questions unasked. "Are humans really as scary as everyone says?" Tova thought about this for a moment, and she thought about Commander Akafer standing on his porch watching the sunset, and she thought about Dr. Vasquez reading bedtime stories, and she thought about Khan clicking his mandibles while children laughed. And she thought about a giant marine crying on his knees on a cold metal floor because he was so happy she was alive. And then she smiled, the kind of smile that starts slow and gets bigger, and carries the warmth of someone who knows something important that most of the galaxy is still figuring out. "Only if you are mean to kids," she said. Selha laughed, and Tova laughed too, and the sound of their laughter drifted across the lavender fields and up into the darkness where the stars hung ancient and cold and impossibly far away. But between the 2 children sitting in the grass, the universe felt very small and very warm and very safe. Across 1,000 worlds, in 100 languages, the lesson had been written into the laws and the histories and the bedtime stories that parents told their children before sleep. And the lesson was always the same no matter how it was told. You could challenge humanity's borders and they would negotiate. You could insult their leaders and they would shrug. You could even destroy their ships and they would rebuild them and bear no lasting grudge. But their children were the line. Their children were the bright and burning center of everything they were, the reason they built and explored and reached for the stars in the first place. And the love they carried for their young was not a weakness, but a force as old and as powerful as gravity itself. Cross that line, and the universe would remind you, with fire and steel, and the unstoppable fury of a species that had crawled out of the mud of a small blue world, and clawed its way to the stars with nothing but stubbornness and love. that some things in this galaxy are sacred, and sacred things are not to be touched.